Welcome back to the True Crime Network. I'm your host and investigator, Samuel. Tonight, we dive into a story that has shaken not just Nigeria, but the international community. It is a tale of power, manipulation, bloodshed, and justice that crosses borders, from the dusty roads of southeastern Nigeria to the icy streets of Finland. At the center of it all stands one man, Simon Ekpa, a Nigerian-born Finnish citizen, who proclaimed himself the Prime Minister of the Biafra Government in exile. But behind the political slogans and fiery broadcasts lies a darker reality: violence, extortion, and a trail of broken lives. Stay tuned, subscribe to True Crime Network, and drop your thoughts in the comments, because this isn't just history. This is ongoing, and the truth is still unfolding. Simon Ekpa's story begins in Engbo, Ebonyi State, Nigeria, where he was born in 1985. His childhood was marked by the same struggles many in southeastern Nigeria faced: poverty, lack of opportunities, and the lingering wounds of the Nigerian Civil War, known to the Igbo people as the Biafran War. For many, the memory of Biafra was more than history, it was an open scar. Ekpa grew up hearing stories of suffering, starvation, and promises of a homeland that never came to be. From a young age, he displayed ambition. Locals described him as sharp-tongued, persuasive, and always hungry for attention. In his 20s, he found a way out of Nigeria, relocating to Finland, where he studied law and eventually gained Finnish citizenship. On paper, it was a success story, a young African immigrant building a new life in Europe. But Ekpa was not content with a quiet life. He wanted influence. He wanted power. In 2020, after years of staying relatively unknown, his name began to circulate in Nigerian diaspora groups online. He positioned himself as a defender of the Igbo people, an activist who would speak against corruption in Nigeria, and most importantly, someone who would revive the Biafran independence movement. That movement was not new. The indigenous people of Biafra, IPOB, led by Nnamdi Kanu, had already gained notoriety for organizing protests and demanding secession. But when Kanu was arrested by Nigerian authorities in 2021, a vacuum opened. Ekpa saw an opportunity. From his apartment in Lahti, Finland, he launched live broadcasts on social media, speaking with fiery passion. He condemned the Nigerian government, called for a total shutdown of southeastern Nigeria through his infamous sit-at-home orders, and presented himself as the new leader who would carry the torch of Biafra. People listened. Some admired his boldness, others feared his words. The sit-at-home orders, days when businesses, schools, and transport in Igbo states were forced to shut down, began to paralyze local economies. At first, people complied voluntarily, thinking they were supporting the cause. But soon, violence followed. Gunmen enforcing Ekpa's orders attacked traders, burned vehicles, and killed civilians who dared to defy the shutdown. Back in Finland, Ekpa denied involvement. He claimed he was only giving political direction. But in Nigeria, his voice was interpreted as a command. Families were torn apart, markets were emptied, and streets turned red with blood. For many Nigerians, a question arose: how could a man thousands of kilometers away, in a quiet European country, hold such dangerous power over communities back home? This was the beginning of a darker chapter. And it was here that my work as an investigator began, because behind every broadcast, behind every order, there were victims. And their voices demanded to be heard. Chapter 2: The Shadow of IPOB and the Government in Exile. The indigenous people of Biafra, IPOB, had long been a thorn in the side of the Nigerian government. What began as a political movement demanding the independence of Biafra evolved over time into a network with both political and militant wings. For many Igbo people, IPOB represented hope, a chance to reclaim dignity after decades of marginalization. But for others, it became a source of fear. When Nnamdi Kanu was detained in 2021, the movement fractured. Factions emerged, each claiming to carry the true vision of Biafra. It was during this turbulent period that Simon Ekpa began consolidating power. From Finland, he declared himself the Prime Minister of the Biafra Government in exile, a move that drew both criticism and admiration. Ekpa's claim was bold, almost audacious. He did not merely lead a political faction, he positioned himself as the ultimate authority of a government that existed nowhere physically, yet whose reach extended deep into southeastern Nigeria. Through WhatsApp groups, Facebook broadcasts, and YouTube videos, he issued directives that many interpreted as orders. Business closures, school shutdowns, and public demonstrations. It was not just political messaging. Ekpa's government came with its own set of enforcers, men and women who operated in Nigeria, often masked and often armed. They were tasked with ensuring compliance with Ekpa's directives. For many in the region, defiance came at a steep cost. Markets were torched. Vehicles were vandalized. Traders and commuters were beaten or even killed. Those who resisted were labeled traitors to the Biafran cause, making them targets. I began to map Ekpa's network as part of my investigation. Despite the geographic distance, his fingerprints were everywhere. Social media was his weapon. Carefully crafted propaganda inspired fear and loyalty simultaneously. Every post, every video, every directive was analyzed for hidden messages. Sometimes, coded language was used to hint at upcoming operations. Other times, threats were explicit, leaving little room for interpretation. It became clear that Ekpa's influence was sustained through a mix of ideology, intimidation, and financial support. Money flowed from diaspora donors in Europe and North America, funneled through networks that were difficult to trace. Local enforcers received pay, weapons, and instructions to carry out acts that would paralyze entire towns. The more violent the response, the stronger Ekpa appeared to his followers. By early 2022, the government in exile had become a parallel authority. Schools in southeastern Nigeria often closed without warning, citing Ekpa's directives. Traders feared violent attacks if they opened their shops. Even hospitals reported disruptions, leaving communities vulnerable. Families lived in constant tension, not knowing whether they would wake up the next morning to destruction or death. Yet, the Nigerian authorities struggled to respond. Ekpa's physical presence in Finland made him legally untouchable. Diplomatic channels were slow. Requests for extradition were complicated by international law, Finland's judicial system, and questions about whether his broadcasts constituted incitement or merely political speech. Meanwhile, the people on the ground suffered, and the stories of victims began piling up on my desk. I collected dozens of statements, parents of children attacked, traders whose shops were burned, and local activists who had been threatened. Patterns emerged. The same villages reported similar attacks, always following Ekpa's directives. Witnesses described masked enforcers carrying weapons, checking homes for compliance with sit-at-home orders, and punishing anyone who disobeyed. One particularly chilling report came from Amuniochi, a town in Abia State. On a Sunday morning, local enforcers blocked the main road. Traders who dared to open their shops were beaten severely, while their wares were destroyed. The attackers carried banners that read, "Biafra must rise. Defiance will not be tolerated." This was the reality of Ekpa's shadow government, a network that operated with impunity, fueled by ideology, social media influence, and fear. The line between political activism and criminal operation blurred entirely. It was also in this chapter of the investigation that I began to see the deeper complexity. Ekpa was not acting alone. Local political figures, corrupt security officials, and diaspora financiers created a protective web around him. The network was sophisticated, and any effort to dismantle it would require not just fieldwork in Nigeria, but international collaboration. I realized that the story of Simon Ekpa was more than a tale of political ambition. It was a blueprint of modern transnational influence, where a man in Europe could wield deadly power in Africa without ever leaving his home. Understanding this network would become the cornerstone of the investigation, and it would take months of surveillance, interviews, and cross-border intelligence gathering to uncover the truth. By the end of 2022, it was undeniable, Simon Ekpa's government in exile was no longer theoretical. It was real and deadly. Blood on the streets, violence. In southeastern Nigeria. By mid-2022, the human cost of Simon Ekpa's influence had become undeniable. Towns across Abia, Enugu, Ebonyi, and Imo states experienced unprecedented disruption. What began as ideological activism had escalated into a climate of fear and violence. Communities reported coordinated attacks on traders, commuters, and even students. Vehicles on major highways were ambushed. Shops that dared to open during Ekpa's sit-at-home days were looted and burned. In some areas, villagers were forcibly confined to their homes while masked enforcers patrolled the streets. I received detailed reports from multiple victims. One case involved a mother named Amaka Obi, whose small market stall was set ablaze after she refused to comply with Ekpa's orders. Witnesses reported seeing armed men wearing black masks, shouting slogans about Biafra rising, and threatening anyone who resisted. Amaka barely escaped with her life, suffering severe injuries to her arms and legs. Another report came from Enugu, where a bus carrying commuters was stopped by Ekpa's enforcers. Passengers were forced to get off, and the vehicle was destroyed. Several people were beaten, and one man died on the spot. Eyewitnesses described the attackers as organized, almost military-like, operating with efficiency that suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous crime. The violence was not random, it followed patterns, always tied to Ekpa's broadcasts. On days he issued public messages urging compliance with Biafra shutdowns, attacks spiked. Local authorities were powerless, police often refused to intervene, either due to fear, corruption, or sympathies toward Ekpa's movement. As I dug deeper, it became clear that Ekpa's strategy relied on psychological control as much as physical violence. Fear was a weapon. Every attack reinforced his power, signaling to the population that obedience was the only safe option. Yet, simultaneously, propaganda painted him as a protector of Igbo identity and dignity. The duality made him untouchable in many minds. Financial support from the diaspora enabled Ekpa's enforcers to operate with sophistication. Weapons, vehicles, and communication devices flowed seamlessly across borders. I traced payments through intermediaries in Europe, often disguised as donations for humanitarian or cultural purposes. This funding network ensured that local operatives had the means to enforce Ekpa's directives with brutality and precision. By late 2022, reports of kidnappings also surfaced. Families were forced to pay ransom or publicly pledge loyalty to Ekpa's government in exile. One high-profile case involved a school principal in Aka, who was kidnapped and held for 3 days because the school remained open during a sit-at-home directive. The ordeal left the principal traumatized and sent a clear warning to educators throughout the region. The human stories were heartbreaking. Children unable to attend school, families living. Samuel's investigation, following the money and messages. As the body count in southeastern Nigeria rose, my focus sharpened. The violence was real, the victims were countless, but the man orchestrating it all was sitting comfortably in Lodi, Finland. If I was to connect him directly to the bloodshed, I needed evidence, solid, undeniable proof that could withstand both Nigerian and international scrutiny. That meant following two trails, the money and the messages. The digital footprint. Simon Ekpa was a man of the internet. His primary weapon was not a gun or a machete but a camera, a microphone, and a social media account. His fiery broadcasts reached tens of thousands across the diaspora and millions back home. Every sit-at-home directive, every veiled threat, and every provocative message was recorded in digital space. I began cataloging these videos, studying them not as political speeches but as coded instructions. On several occasions, his broadcasts contained seemingly casual phrases like, "They must learn the hard way. No shop should open tomorrow, anyone who defies us will regret it. Biafra will not come through cowards." Within hours or days of these messages, violence would erupt. Traitors were punished, buses ambushed, and entire neighborhoods paralyzed. This pattern could not be ignored. I cross-referenced timestamps of his broadcasts with reported incidents in Nigeria. The alignment was chilling. His words were not abstract rhetoric, they were operational signals. Following the money. The second trail was financial. Rumors swirled about money flowing into Ekpa's network, but I needed to verify it. With the help of contacts in both Europe and Nigeria, I began tracing transactions linked to his supporters. The pattern emerged quickly. 1. Diaspora donations, Nigerians in the US, UK. Canada, and other countries made contributions under the guise of supporting Biafran self-determination. 2. Hidden channels. Funds were sent via money transfer services, cryptocurrency wallets, and even personal bank accounts disguised as family remittances. 3. Local distribution. Once in Nigeria, these funds were funneled to operatives who purchased weapons, motorbikes, and communication tools for enforcing sit-at-home orders. One particularly revealing transaction involved a payment of €8,000 sent from a group in Germany to an account linked to one of Ekpa's close associates in Lagos. Within weeks of that transfer, multiple violent incidents were reported in Imo State. Weapons were recovered, and at least 2 arrested operatives admitted under interrogation that their funding came from abroad. Hidden messages. Beyond money, I discovered another layer of communication: encrypted messages. While Ekpa's public broadcasts served as broad instructions, private channels on Telegram and WhatsApp carried more specific directives. Screenshots leaked from insiders showed messages like, "Secure ABA by 6 a.m. No movements. Deal with the stubborn ones, let others learn. Funds arriving tomorrow, wait for instructions." These were not the words of a political activist, they were the words of a commander. Local collaboration. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing the revelations. Some local politicians were quietly sympathetic to Ekpa. They viewed him as a destabilizing force that could be leveraged for their own gain. Others paid him off to avoid becoming targets. Meanwhile, corrupt security officers often looked the other way, allowing his operatives to operate freely. One source, a former IPOB member who turned informant, told me, "Ekpa doesn't need to be in Nigeria. His voice is enough. He has soldiers on the ground, men who fear him, and men who profit from him. If he says, close the market, no one dares open. If he says, punish them, they move immediately." The challenge. Despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, I faced a daunting challenge. Legally, Ekpa was insulated by distance. Under Finnish law, freedom of speech was protected, and his lawyers argued that he was merely expressing political opinions. But the evidence I was compiling painted a darker reality. His words were direct incitement to violence. The task ahead was clear but dangerous. I had to gather enough evidence to prove beyond doubt that his broadcasts and financial networks were directly tied to killings in Nigeria. Only then could international legal mechanisms be triggered. Turning point. The turning point came in late 2022 when I gained access to a private communication channel used by one of Ekpa's key lieutenants in Nigeria. Through a mixture of luck, persistence, and cooperation from local contacts, I intercepted instructions that directly linked a planned sit-at-home order to a violent attack that occurred in Owerri. This was the first smoking gun, a bridge between Ekpa's words in Finland and blood spilled on Nigerian soil. But exposing it would not be easy. Powerful interests wanted this truth buried. Some feared destabilization. Others profited from the chaos. And as I would soon discover, corruption within Nigeria's own agencies would make the road ahead treacherous. Yet, as an investigator, I had no choice. The voices of the victims demanded justice. And I was determined to follow this trail wherever it led, even if it meant confronting forces larger than one man. Betrayal, hidden agents, and corruption. The deeper I went into this case, the clearer it became: Simon Ekpa was not acting in isolation. His network was layered, and within it, betrayal and corruption thrived. To dismantle the structure, I had to shine a light not just on Ekpa, but also on the hidden actors who enabled his rise. Betrayal within IPOB. When Nnamdi Kanu was arrested in 2021, IPOB fractured. Several senior members opposed Ekpa's rise, labeling him an opportunist. But others, seduced by his charisma and access to diaspora funding, sided with him. The result was a bloody internal struggle. I interviewed a former IPOB member in hiding who explained. Some of us believed in Kanu's vision. But when Ekpa came, he promised money, weapons, and international support. Many sold out. Those who resisted were silenced. Some disappeared. We knew who gave the orders. This betrayal within IPOB gave Ekpa an edge. By exploiting division, he consolidated power. But it also revealed his ruthlessness. He was willing to sacrifice his own people to strengthen his authority. Hidden agents. During my investigation, I stumbled on a startling revelation: Ekpa had allies in unexpected places. Corrupt officials within Nigeria's security agencies provided cover for his operatives. A police officer in Imo State, who spoke under anonymity, admitted that some of his colleagues were complicit. When the enforcers strike, we are told to stand down. Sometimes they even share money with senior officers. If you try to act, you risk your life or your job. Everyone knows this. These hidden agents ensured Ekpa's network remained untouchable. Roadblocks mysteriously vanished when his men were on the move. Arrests were delayed, and case files were lost. For every honest officer trying to protect civilians, there were two others profiting from chaos. Political opportunism. It wasn't just the police. Local politicians quietly used Ekpa's movement as leverage. In some states, governors turned a blind eye, calculating that instability could weaken rivals or justify increased security budgets. Others secretly funneled money to his operatives in exchange for electoral support. One chilling report reached me in late 2022. A prominent politician in Anambra allegedly met with intermediaries loyal to Ekpa, negotiating peace in exchange for campaign favors. Whether the story was fully accurate or not, it highlighted the unholy marriage of politics and violence that plagued the region. The cost of corruption. The cost of these betrayals was paid in blood. Every bribe accepted, every order ignored, and every corrupt deal struck meant more innocent lives lost. Communities were left defenseless, forced to obey Ekpa's directives not out of loyalty but out of fear. The voices of victims haunted me. A teacher in Abakaliki whispered during an interview, "We are trapped. The government cannot protect us. The police take money and disappear. The politicians speak loudly in public. But quietly they benefit from our suffering. Who will save us?" Her words echoed the despair of thousands. Cracks in the network. But corruption also created cracks. Some insiders, disgusted by the violence, began leaking information. One such insider provided me with a series of encrypted chats between Ekpa's lieutenants and local enforcers. In them, financial transactions were discussed openly, alongside orders for targeted intimidation. The betrayal worked both ways. While Ekpa relied on loyalty, fear, and money to maintain control, he also created enemies within his ranks. Those who felt cheated, abandoned, or underpaid became potential informants. This was the weakness I aimed to exploit. Dangerous ground. By exposing these hidden agents, I was walking dangerous ground. The closer I came to linking Ekpa's network with corrupt officials, the more resistance I faced. Phone calls warning me to drop the case became frequent. Anonymous messages threatened my safety. In Nigeria, some of my local contacts went into hiding after their involvement with me was discovered. Still, I pressed on. Because every lie uncovered, every act of corruption exposed, brought me one step closer to holding Ekpa accountable. The bigger picture. It was no longer just about one man. This was about a system where betrayal, hidden agents, and corruption turned a political movement into a machine of terror. Ekpa thrived because the environment allowed him to. Until that system was dismantled, the bloodshed would continue. But fate was about to shift. International eyes were turning toward him, and the safety of his European haven was beginning to crack. Finland, once silent, would soon be forced to act. The arrest in Finland. By early 2023, the situation in southeastern Nigeria had reached a boiling point. Violence linked to Simon Ekpa's sit-at-home orders intensified, international human rights groups began raising alarms, and diaspora donors were coming under scrutiny. The Nigerian government, under growing pressure from its citizens, finally pushed harder through diplomatic channels. The target was clear: get Finland to act. Mounting international pressure. For months, Nigerian officials had petitioned Finland, demanding action against Ekpa. At first, Finnish authorities were cautious. From their perspective, Ekpa was a Finnish citizen exercising free speech. Unless there was concrete proof that his actions directly caused violence, they could not arrest him. But my investigation, combined with testimonies from survivors and leaked communications, began making waves. Journalists in Finland started asking uncomfortable questions. Why was a man living in their country allegedly inciting bloodshed thousands of kilometers away? The pressure grew louder after the European Union received formal complaints from Nigeria, and the United Nations noted concerns about escalating violence in the southeast. Finland, a country known for upholding peace and human rights, could no longer ignore the spotlight. The tipping point. The final push came in February 2023, when Ekpa publicly called for a 5-day sit-at-home order that crippled much of southeastern Nigeria. Reports of killings, kidnappings, and destruction filled the headlines. Victims' families shared heart-wrenching stories. International media picked it up, painting Finland in a negative light for harboring the man behind the chaos. On February 23, 2023, just 2 days before Nigeria's general elections, Finnish police finally acted. The raid. At around 7 a.m., Finnish security forces moved in. They stormed Ekpa's apartment in Lahti, executing a court order to bring him in for questioning. The arrest was swift but calculated. Authorities wanted to avoid giving him the chance to broadcast or spin the moment into propaganda. Neighbors described the scene as surreal. One recalled, "I saw unmarked vehicles outside. Then suddenly, officers in black went in. It was over quickly. Within minutes, he was in custody." For many Nigerians, news of the arrest spread like wildfire. Social media erupted with celebrations. Videos of people dancing in the streets of Enugu and Aba circulated, with captions like "Finally, justice begins." But others, particularly Ekpa's loyal supporters, denounced the arrest. Some even staged protests outside Finnish embassies abroad, claiming he was being silenced for fighting for Biafra. Inside the interrogation. Though the Finnish police did not initially disclose details, sources revealed that Ekpa was interrogated about his role in inciting violence, his funding sources, and his communications with operatives in Nigeria. Investigators also seized his electronic devices, phones, laptops, and storage drives, for forensic analysis. The key questions were: did his broadcasts directly amount to incitement to violence? Was there a financial trail linking him to armed groups in Nigeria? Could Finnish law prosecute him, or would extradition be considered? The legal maze. Despite his arrest, Ekpa was not immediately charged. Finnish law required a high threshold of evidence to prove incitement to violence abroad. His lawyers quickly argued that he was merely a political activist, not a criminal mastermind. They framed his words as free speech, protected under democratic rights. Meanwhile, Nigerian officials pushed for his extradition. But extradition was complicated. As a Finnish citizen, he could not easily be handed over. International law demanded that if Finland refused extradition, they must prosecute him under their own system. This created a tense diplomatic standoff. Public reaction. Back in Nigeria, reactions were mixed. Victims' families saw the arrest as the first step toward justice. Traders in Aba prayed that violence would finally end. Parents in Enugu hoped their children could return to school safely. But Ekpa's supporters doubled down, claiming his detention was proof that the Biafran struggle was real. And that he was being persecuted. Propaganda videos painted him as a martyr, fueling new waves of anger. My perspective. For me as an investigator, the arrest was a breakthrough. For months, I had followed his trail, collecting evidence, connecting dots, and exposing networks. To see Finnish authorities finally take action was vindication. But it was also just the beginning. Because I knew the fight was far from over. Ekpa was a man who thrived on attention, and even in detention, his influence lingered. His words, recorded and circulated, continued to echo in the minds of his followers. The real test would be whether the international community had the resolve to hold him accountable or whether he would slip through the cracks of legal technicalities and political bargaining. Voices of the victims. Behind every statistic, behind every news headline, were real people whose lives had been shattered by Simon Ekpa's directives. Numbers could never fully capture the pain. To understand the true impact of his actions, I traveled across southeastern Nigeria, meeting survivors, grieving families, and communities living under constant fear. Their stories painted a picture of despair, resilience, and longing for justice. Amaka's scars. In Onitsha, I met Amaka Obi, the market woman whose stall was set ablaze for defying a sit-at-home order. Her arms still bore the scars of the fire. Her voice trembled as she recounted the attack. "I only wanted to feed my children. That morning, I prayed before opening my shop. Within an hour, they came. They poured petrol and lit a match. I screamed, but nobody helped, they were too afraid. My children now cry whenever they see fire. What crime did I commit, other than wanting to live?" Her story reflected the cruel logic of fear, obedience through terror. A father's grief. In Owerri, I met Chief Okri, whose 19-year-old son was killed while returning from school. The boy had boarded a bus that was stopped by masked enforcers. They forced passengers out, and when his son protested, they shot him. Tears welled in the father's eyes as he showed me a faded photograph. He was my only son. He wanted to become a doctor. Now he is gone, and the man responsible sits in comfort in Finland. How can that be justice? His grief was shared by countless parents who had buried their children too soon. The school that closed. In Abakaliki, I visited a secondary school that had shut its doors indefinitely. The principal explained, "We cannot operate safely. Twice, our teachers were attacked. Parents are too afraid to send their children. Education has stopped, and the children are the ones paying the price." Empty classrooms, broken desks, and abandoned chalkboards stood as silent witnesses to the destruction of hope. Generations of children were being robbed of their future in the name of a struggle they did not understand. Traitors of ABA. ABA, the commercial heartbeat of the Southeast, had been brought to its knees. Traders told me how they lost millions in goods and revenue. One man, Chaikyud, said, "We used to trade with people from all over Nigeria. Now no one comes. Our city is like a ghost town. On sit-at-home days, you don't hear the sound of engines, only fear." Is this freedom? No, it is slavery. His frustration was palpable. For many, the so-called fight for liberation had become a prison. The silence of the streets. During one sit-at-home day in Enugu, I walked through streets that should have been bustling with life. Shops were shuttered. Roads were empty. Even churches had closed their doors. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional roar of motorbikes carrying armed enforcers. Residents whispered from behind locked doors. A woman peered out of a window and said softly, "We are prisoners in our own land. We fear both the government and the men who claim to fight for us." Where do we run? Trauma that lingers. The psychological scars ran deep. Families lived with constant anxiety. Children developed nightmares. Survivors spoke of sleepless nights, haunted by memories of gunfire and flames. Entire communities carried invisible wounds that would take generations to heal. Why their voices matter? These voices mattered because they exposed the reality behind the rhetoric. Ekpa claimed he was fighting for freedom and dignity, but the people living under his directives experienced only fear and destruction. His supporters abroad saw slogans and ideals, those at home saw blood and ashes. As an investigator, amplifying these voices was as important as exposing the financial networks or digital messages. Because justice was not just about prosecuting one man, it was about restoring dignity to the victims. Their testimonies became the backbone of my case file, evidence that could not be dismissed. They proved beyond doubt that Ekpa's words had consequences, and those consequences were measured in human lives. A haunting truth. As I left each community, I carried their stories with me. But one truth haunted me most: even if Ekpa were to face justice, the scars he left behind would never fully heal. The voices of the victims were not just part of an investigation, they were a reminder of why this fight mattered. The courtroom battles. The arrest of Simon Ekpa in Finland was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of a new war, one fought not with guns or broadcasts, but with legal arguments, evidence, and political pressure. Courtrooms in both Finland and Nigeria became battlegrounds where the definition of justice was tested. The first hearings in Finland. When Ekpa was brought before Finnish authorities in early 2023, his lawyers quickly framed the narrative: their client was a political activist, not a criminal. They argued that his fiery speeches were protected under Finland's constitutional right to freedom of expression. One of his attorneys declared, "Mr. Ekpa has never lifted a weapon, never ordered anyone to kill. He is a voice of dissent, not a commander of violence." But the prosecution countered with evidence gathered from victims, intercepted communications, and financial trails. Prosecutors argued that his broadcasts were not mere opinions, they were operational instructions that directly led to violence in Nigeria. The hearings drew international attention. Nigerian media covered every detail, while Finnish outlets debated the limits of free speech in a globalized world. Could a man legally living in Finland be held accountable for crimes committed in another continent? Nigeria's push for extradition. Meanwhile, the Nigerian government pushed aggressively for extradition. Officials argued that Ekpa was no different from a terrorist leader orchestrating attacks abroad. They filed formal requests, citing international law and treaties against cross-border terrorism. But the road was not simple. As a Finnish citizen, Ekpa was shielded by strong protections against extradition. Under Finnish law, their citizens are rarely handed over to foreign governments. The burden fell on Finland to decide whether to prosecute him at home or release him. This legal tug-of-war created uncertainty. Nigerians demanded justice, but Finnish courts had to balance law, human rights, and international diplomacy. Testimonies of the victims. To strengthen the case, testimonies from victims in Nigeria were submitted to Finnish authorities. Survivors spoke through video recordings, describing how Ekpa's broadcasts triggered violence in their communities. Parents showed photographs of children killed. Traders displayed the ruins of their shops. One victim, speaking through a translator, said, "He may not hold the gun, but his words load the bullets. Without him, we would not be suffering." These testimonies carried emotional weight, reminding the court that the consequences of Ekpa's actions were not abstract, they were written in blood. The defense strategy. Ekpa's defense team relied on several key strategies. 1. Denial of control, claiming he had no direct authority over those committing violence in Nigeria. 2. Political framing, portraying him as a freedom fighter targeted for his activism. 3. Freedom of speech, insisting his broadcasts were opinion, not orders. 4. International distrust, arguing that Nigeria's judicial system could not guarantee a fair trial if he were extradited. These arguments resonated with some observers in Finland, especially those unfamiliar with the scale of violence in Nigeria. Public reactions. Outside the courtroom, the battles raged online. Supporters of Biafra flooded social media with hashtags demanding Ekpa's release, calling him a hero. At the same time, Nigerian activists and victims' families launched campaigns insisting he be held accountable. Protests erupted outside Nigerian embassies abroad, with placards reading, "Free Ekpa" on one side and "Justice for the victims" on the other. The conflict had transcended borders, becoming a global spectacle. A divided court. Weeks turned into months as hearings continued. Evidence was reviewed, arguments made, and political pressure mounted. Finnish judges faced a complex dilemma. If they freed him, they risked international backlash and the continuation of violence in Nigeria. If they prosecuted him, they set a precedent for holding citizens accountable for incitement abroad. If they extradited him, they risked criticism over Nigeria's human rights record. The courtroom became a mirror of global politics, where justice was not just about guilt or innocence but about international relations, human rights, and diplomacy. My role. As an investigator, I submitted my findings, financial trails, communication leaks, and interviews with victims as evidence. I testified that his influence was not symbolic but operational. I reminded the court that neutrality in the face of bloodshed was complicity. The courtroom silence after one of my statements was heavy. I had said, "Freedom of speech ends where innocent blood begins. And too much blood has been spilled." The unfinished battle. By late 2023, the case was still ongoing. Ekpa's lawyers filed appeals. Nigeria continued diplomatic pressure. Finland deliberated carefully, knowing that whatever decision they made would echo far beyond their borders. For the victims, justice still felt distant. For his supporters, he remained a symbol of resistance. And for the world, the case highlighted a new challenge. In the digital age, one man with a microphone could destabilize entire regions from across the globe. The courtroom battles were far from over, but one thing was clear: Simon Ekpa's fate would be decided not just by law, but by history. International pressure and dark networks. The courtroom battles may have placed Simon Ekpa under legal scrutiny, but behind the scenes, a much bigger struggle was unfolding. Governments, intelligence agencies, and hidden financiers circled the case like vultures, each with their own interests. Ekpa was not just a man in exile, he was a symbol, a pawn, and, to some, a tool in a game of power stretching far beyond Nigeria. Diplomatic pressure mounts. Nigeria's leaders knew that justice against Ekpa could not be won in isolation. They leaned heavily on diplomatic channels, sending envoys to Helsinki and lobbying European Union officials. The message was clear: this man's actions are fueling terrorism in our country. If Europe allows him to continue, the blood is on your hands. Behind closed doors, Finnish diplomats wrestled with competing demands. On one side, they valued their relationship with Nigeria, a key trade partner and regional powerhouse. On the other, they faced human rights advocates warning that extradition to Nigeria could lead to torture or unfair trial. The EU watched closely, aware that the outcome could set a precedent for how Europe deals with exiled agitators across the world. The shadow of dark networks. As I dug deeper, one question gnawed me: who was funding Simon Ekpa's operations? His broadcasts, propaganda networks, and ability to mobilize enforcers in Nigeria required resources far beyond what a single man could muster. Following the money trail, I uncovered a web of donations, much of it funneled through cryptocurrency. Transactions flowed from diaspora groups in Europe and North America, but there were also signs of deeper, more sinister connections, money moving from shell companies with links to international arms dealers and political operatives. These networks were not just about ideology. They thrived on chaos. In unstable regions, weapons sold faster, smuggling routes opened wider, and governments grew desperate. For some, the violence in southeastern Nigeria was a business opportunity. Intelligence agencies take notice. It wasn't long before I realized that Western intelligence agencies were quietly monitoring the case. The CIA, MI6, and even Interpol had files on Ekpa. Not necessarily because of his ideology, but because of the instability his actions created. Every act of violence in Nigeria threatened oil supply chains, trade routes, and regional security. One retired intelligence officer confided to me off the record: "When someone in Finland can destabilize an entire region in Africa with a microphone, we pay attention." Not because of him, but because of the ripple effects. Ekpa had unwittingly placed himself at the intersection of global security concerns. Propaganda wars. As legal and diplomatic battles raged, a parallel war played out online. Social media became a weapon. Hashtags, doctored videos, and fake news flooded platforms. Ekpa's supporters portrayed him as a freedom fighter silenced by colonial powers. Nigerian activists portrayed him as a terrorist hiding behind free speech. Cyber investigators traced many of these campaigns to troll farms, some based in Eastern Europe, others in Africa. It became clear that Ekpa's image was being manipulated not only by genuine supporters but also by actors seeking to exploit division. The victims forgotten. In the midst of international debates and power struggles, the voices of the victims risked being drowned out. Their pain was reduced to talking points in diplomatic memos and soundbites in global media. I carried their testimonies into every meeting I attended, reminding policymakers and journalists that this was not just a geopolitical puzzle, it was a human tragedy. For every speech Ekpa made, lives were lost. For every delayed decision in Finland, another family buried their child in Nigeria. A dangerous web. The deeper I went, the clearer it became. Simon Ekpa was a node in a much larger web. His role was significant, but he was not the mastermind of everything. There were hidden benefactors who thrived in shadows, men and women who never appeared on broadcasts but whose fingerprints were on every act of chaos. If Ekpa fell, someone else could rise. That realization was chilling. The fight for justice was not just about stopping one man but dismantling an entire network of fear and profit. The world watching. By late 2023, pressure reached its peak. International headlines asked, should Finland prosecute Simon Ekpa? Human rights groups, African leaders, and Western politicians clashed over the answer. Whatever happened next would shape not only Ekpa's future but also the credibility of international law in the age of digital warfare. And in the middle of it all, I stood as an investigator, carrying the weight of victims' stories, tracing the money trails, and trying to untangle a web that stretched from Nigerian villages to European boardrooms. The world was watching. But justice, as always, remained uncertain. Conclusion: the unfinished story. When I first began investigating Simon Ekpa, I thought it would be a straightforward case, a man broadcasting chaos from afar, the law catching up to him, and justice being served. But the deeper I went, the more I realized this was not a simple story of guilt and punishment. It was a maze where politics, power, and pain twisted every path. The man behind the curtain. Ekpa presented himself as a leader, a liberator, a voice for the voiceless. But the evidence told a darker story. His words were not just slogans, they were orders that fueled fires, emptied streets, and silenced lives. He became both a symbol and a weapon, used by networks far larger than himself. Yet, even as courts deliberated and governments argued, he remained defiant. In interviews, he smiled, dismissed the bloodshed, and claimed history would vindicate him. To his followers, he was untouchable, a hero in exile. To his victims, he was a shadow of death. The cost of silence. Throughout my investigation, one question haunted me: how did it come to this? How did one man, living thousands of miles away, gain so much control over millions back home? The answer was painful: silence. Silence from governments too slow to act. Silence from international bodies unwilling to confront uncomfortable truths. Silence from communities too afraid to speak. Every day that silence lasted, more people suffered. And even as the world debated his fate, the fires he lit continued to burn in southeastern Nigeria. The victim's legacy. I returned to the villages, the towns, the families torn apart. Their faces stayed with me. The father holding his son's photograph. The woman showing her burned scars. The children whose classrooms had been abandoned. Their pain was real. Their stories were evidence. And their voices demanded to be remembered. For them, this was never about politics or speeches, it was about survival. Justice for Simon Ekpa would mean nothing if their suffering remained unseen. Justice or delay. By the end of 2023, the Finnish courts had not yet delivered a final verdict. The Nigerian government still pressed for extradition. Human rights groups still raised alarms. And ordinary people in Nigeria still counted the cost of waiting. Justice was not denied, but it was delayed. And delay, for the victims, was another form of suffering. The larger battle. I realized something bigger: even if Ekpa were convicted, the fight was far from over. The networks that funded him still existed. The enforcers in Nigeria still had guns. The propaganda still spread like wildfire online. Stopping one man would not erase the scars. The real battle was against the system of fear, manipulation, and exploitation that gave him power in the first place. My final words. As I file this report for the True Crime Network, I think of the role of investigators like me. We are not heroes, we are witnesses. Our job is to uncover the truth, to amplify the voices of those silenced, and to remind the world that behind every statistic lies a human life. Simon Ekpa's story is not finished. His trial continues. His influence lingers. His networks adapt. But so too does the resolve of the victims, the courage of communities, and the demand for justice. And so, this investigation closes not with a period, but with a comma. Because the story of Simon Ekpa is still being written by courts, by governments, and most importantly, by the survivors who refuse to be forgotten. Epilogue. Samuel's reflection. This is Samuel, your investigator and host, signing off. If you've stayed with me through this long and difficult journey, I ask you to honor the victims by keeping their stories alive. Share this video. Leave a comment. Subscribe to True Crime Network so we can continue exposing the truth. Because until justice is served, the story remains unfinished.